It looks like everyone has been admitted. So let me see here. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Dr. Karen Harper. I'm the president of the Nashville Jung Circle, and I am so delighted to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Lionel Corbett. He's one of my former professors at Pacifica Graduate Institute. And before I do so, introduce him, please keep yourselves muted. I think there'll be question and answer at the end of his lecture, so appreciate your patience with that. And regarding Dr. Corbett, he is trained in medicine and psychiatry in England and is a Jungian Analyst, I think from the Chicago Institute. And he has authored at least 6 books, so there may be more, numerous articles, and he is a professor of depth psychology at Pacifica Graduate Institute. His primary focus is the religious function of the psyche. And so please help us welcome Dr. Corbett tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. Well, good evening, everyone. This evening, I'm going to talk about Jung's notion of the self as what he calls the God within, or an image of the divine in the psyche. And I'm going to make the usual distinction, if you can imagine, that when I talk about Jung's self, I'm spelling the word, as it were, with a capital letter S, to distinguish the God within from the personal self, which I would write with, if this were written, with a lowercase s, as in yourself or myself. So what I'm going to do is contrast Jung's approach to the self as the God within with traditional God images of the kind that are found in theistic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and so on. And I want to talk about the ways that the self appears to us symbolically in the psyche and in the form of synchronicity. And then if time permits, I'll say a little bit about Jung's debate with theologians like Martin Buber. And if we have time, talk about Jung's notion of the dark side of the self, the side of the self that causes suffering and evil. And perhaps also suggest a connection to some of the work of the quantum physicist David Bohm. So I'm going to suggest that Jung's work is providing a new way of thinking about the divine, and what I would call a new myth of God that avoids some of the problems associated with traditional images of God in the Judeo-Christian tradition. I also want to show that Jung's approach to the God image allows one to develop a personal connection to the sacred that may be completely unrelated to any traditional accounts of the divine, because the range of ways in which the self, the biggest self, appears in the psyche is much broader than the God images of traditional religions. And this is helpful for people who are not interested anymore in traditional God images, although it does distress fundamentalists, because the fundamentalists want to stick to a kind of a rigid God image. So let me just begin by saying that Jung follows the Lutheran theologian Rudolf Otto, who wrote a book in 1917 called Das Heilige, or the Holy. It's translated into English as The Idea of the Holy, still in print 100 years later, because it's a very important book. And Otto and Jung say that an experience is an experience of the sacred if it has what is called a numinous quality. Okay? Numinous is an adjective that means that the experience is mysterious, tremendous, fascinating, awesome, dreadful, that kind of experience. Think of Moses at the burning bush or Saul on the road to Damascus. You could imagine the overpowering intensity of that kind of experiences. That kind of experience is what Jung would refer to as an experience of the self. Of course, the Judeo-Christian traditions would talk about it in terms of the theistic image of God. However, Jung's point is that experiences with this quality are not confined to these biblical figures like Moses or Saul. They can occur to all of us, but they may occur in a way that has that emotional quality, but doesn't have a Judeo-Christian content. So, for example, an example of what this would look like is a dream of mine in which a gigantic UFO, an unidentified flying object, descends from high above and hovers a short distance above my head. Now, this was in itself pretty frightening and awesome and dreadful, because I didn't know if this huge thing, it was like the UFO in Close Encounters, very large like that. So that was fairly terrifying as it descended. And then what happened was that bright lights shone down from the base of this UFO. And when I looked up, I saw that the base of it was studded with eyes, and the light was coming out of the eyes on the base of the UFO. Now, that has nothing to do with traditional accounts of divinity. The UFO is obviously not a Judeo-Christian symbol of divinity. But the point is that for Jung, this is because of the shape of the UFO, it's what he calls a mandala symbol. Jung thought that mandala symbols, which are highly symmetrical geometric diagrams, some combinations of circles, squares, and crosses, which spontaneously appear within the psyche, are sort of abstract images of the self. So he would say that because of the numinous quality of this mandala, the UFO being mandala shaped, this is actually an image of the self, but it would not be thought to be an experience of the sacred by traditional religionists. But for Jung, the important point is that it was a very numinous experience. It had this huge emotional power. And this is the kind of dream in which the dreamer is seen by the self symbol. This is what Jung meant when he said that the ego realizes that it is the object of a superordinate subject. In other words, when you pay attention to your dream material, you realize that the self is aware of the ego. It's as if the self sees the ego. Now, one of the major differences between Jung and the theological accounts of experiences of the sacred is that the theologians will talk about the divine, so as it were, residing in some kind of heavenly realm, some transcendent heavenly realm. Whereas Jung would say this kind of imagery arises from the depth of the psyche that we refer to as the collective unconscious, or the objective psyche, or the mythopoetic level of the psyche. It has several names. But Jung thinks that all the gods and goddesses, any figure of divinity from any mythological or religious tradition, all those figures arise from this level of the objective psyche. This is very different than seeing the divine as living, as it were, in some kind of heavenly realm. For Jung, the divine is located much more within our own subjectivity in the depth of the psyche. Now, Jung thinks that because of the presence of the self, the bigger self, Jung thinks that religion is inevitable. And the notion of God is ubiquitous. Pretty much wherever you look, you find gods and goddesses, historically and geographically, because the psyche contains this innate archetypal potential to experience a God image. And what he thinks is that this self is projected onto whatever is the local name for God. So if you happen to be living and growing up in a Christian culture, you would project the self onto Christ. If the local name for God is Shiva or some other name, you would project it onto that figure. Any divine being will carry the the projection of the self. The important point for Jung is that what matters is to describe an experience as a manifestation of the self, again, is not its content. It doesn't have to be, you know, an experience of Jesus or the Blessed Virgin Mary. I mean, people still dream about those figures and they're perfectly valid. But many people have experiences like the UFO, which have that numinous, awesome quality, but they're nothing like traditional theistic descriptions of the divine, of the kind that are found in the Bible or in the liturgy or in doctrine and dogma. So the criteria for describing an experience as an experience of the self is the numinous quality of the experience, the emotional power, and secondly, that these are images of wholeness and completion, like mandala symbols. And also another feature that I'll talk about soon is that the self symbols often will combine opposites. So those are the criteria that we look for when we're going to decide that a dream image is a symbol of the self. So I'll give you another example. This is the dream of a woman who says, I was surrounded by a fine mist, and then I sensed a presence as if someone was coming towards me. The mist opened to reveal a gigantic blue eye about 3 feet across. I felt penetrated by its gaze as I stood there in awe and fascination. When you hear words like awe and fascination, you see we're in that realm of the numinous. The contours of the eye became red, orange, and gold. These are significant colors, of course, especially in alchemy. The eye came closer until I was only aware of the round iris, that central portion, the diaphragm of the eye. The iris became square, then round, then square again, continuing to change backwards and forwards from square to round. Then the eye seemed like a huge window or door, and beyond it I could see a world of light. I was excited by this landscape, but also frightened by the sense of infinity, boundlessness, and eternity that I saw. The light beyond the door was unlike any I've ever seen, and so on. She says, I felt as though I was falling into it. So this dream has lots of numinous qualities. It's powerful, mysterious, awesome, and so on. The eye itself is a very ancient symbol of the all-seeing divine. It's found in many religious traditions, the notion of the eye of God. And the dreamer felt as if she'd been seen by a divine eye that acted as a kind of doorway into a spiritual realm. And again, the eye is a perfect mandala, a perfectly symmetrical figure, one of the classical self-symbols. Mandalas always represent an enclosure of sacred space and a point to a spiritual center. And Jung often pointed out that circles and spheres are ancient symbols of the self because they are traditional symbols of infinity, because they have no beginning and no end. So they are symbols of completion or heaven or perfection and so on. And you remember that the iris changes from the circle to the square, and the square, or any symbol of fourness, like a square or a cube, are incarnate or earthly symbols of stability and wholeness, because they tend to refer to the Earth's 4 directions, 4 seasons, 4 winds, 4 elements, and so on. So the square implies order and limitation and form, whereas the circle is endless. So this dream motif of alternately squaring the circle is an interesting teaching. It applies the sort of mutual reciprocity of heaven and earth, or the union of heaven and earth in a higher synthesis. Well, I won't amplify the dream any further, just to point out that it had tremendous emotional power, and it inspired a sense of awe and wonder in the dreamer, which is characteristic of numinous experiences. So it's clearly a numinous self-symbol. Now, we could ask, is this kind of imagery generated by the psyche, generated by the deep unconscious itself, or is it possible that the psyche, that there is a transcendent God beyond the psyche, and it uses the psyche as a kind of medium of transmission, so that this transcendent divinity sort of expresses itself through the psyche using this kind of imagery? And Jung thinks we really can't make that distinction. We really don't know if what we call the collective unconscious is identical with what we call the divine, or identical with what the sort of the metaphysical God of the theistic traditions. All we can say is that the unconscious seems to be the medium from which religious experience seems to flow. Excuse me. So for practical purposes, it's not an important question because we can't tell if there's a divinity beyond the psyche, or whether the psyche itself, excuse me, is generating this kind of imagery. Jung suggests that there is what he calls an original that the image is pointing to, but we can't get out of the psyche. So however it were to manifest itself, we can only experience it by means of the psyche. But the important point is the fact that this kind of imagery appears in the psyche spontaneously helps to explain why human beings have always had a sense of the sacred. This is the result of what Jung calls the religious function of the psyche. It spontaneously produces this kind of imagery. Here's another example of a self symbol. This is from a dream that Jung reports in a letter. And the dream is that the dreamer sees a star in heaven. It's like a bluish diamond with many facets, a beautiful bluish diamond-like star in the sky. And then there's a quiet round pool of water on the earth. And the diamond-like star is reflected in this pool of water. So again, the heavenly diamond is also a self-symbol. It's a perfect shape with many facets to it and eternal and so on. So it has that quality of eternity and preciousness. So it's a self-symbol that's reflected in the small pool, which obviously symbolically represents the individual's psyche. So this is the ancient notion of as above, so below. This is what I would call a teaching dream, that the imagery that we get in our personal psyche is a reflection of something from the other dimensions. Now, our religious traditions are full of this kind of imagery. In the Bible, for example, if you think of the prophet Ezekiel, he has a numinous vision. It's a cloud of light with lightning flashes, with figures in it, with human forms, with 4 faces and 4 wings. I think each had the face of a man, a lion, a bull, and an eagle, and there are wheels beside the figures, and the rims of the wheels are full of eyes. And over that, if I'm remembering properly, is an expanse of crystal, and over that something like a throne with a figure surrounded by fire and radiance that he thought was the glory of God, and so on. This vision, by the way, it was not a dream, it was a waking vision, is often thought to be, it was often seen as in the tradition as the descent of God in a chariot surrounded by angels, and it became a source of inspiration in the Jewish mystical tradition, the chariot mysticism. And parenthetically, when I think about that vision of Ezekiel, it reminds me of the important idea that when people have these experiences, it's also possible, especially the waking visions, like as the prophets, ordinary people sometimes have these waking visions as well. Very often mainstream psychologists will try to reduce or dismiss this kind of experience. And So, for example, Ezekiel's vision, Ezekiel is often being accused of being epileptic or psychotic. And sometimes people have said he may have seen a UFO and he didn't know how to interpret it. And, you know, that reminds me that the experience of Saul on the road to Damascus, when he heard the bright light and heard Jesus's voice saying, "Why do you persecute me?" That also is reduced as just temporal lobe epilepsy, not an experience of the sacred or the holy, but just some kind of a brain aberration. So it's very typical for people, therapists and psychologists who don't have a spiritual orientation, to see this kind of imagery in a reductive way. They try to come up with some explanation for it. And so people, when they have these experiences, are told that they are hysterical or had a temporary psychosis, or this was a hallucination or an overheated imagination, or you know, somebody says, "What were you smoking?" That kind of reduction. But if you have some sense that there is a transpersonal level of the psyche, then you can see this not reductively, but as an emergence from the archetypal level of the psyche. So the range of biblical examples of this, I won't give you any more. The point is that the self can manifest itself empirically. Jung always insists that he's an empiricist or a phenomenologist. He's just describing people's experience. He's often accused of straying from psychology into theology, but he keeps pointing out that I'm not doing theology, I'm talking about people's experiences. These are empirically demonstrable. Anybody can have one of these experiences. This is not a theological notion. It's just a description of the way people sometimes, the experiences that people sometimes have. So because the self for Jung is the totality of the psyche, it includes consciousness and the unconscious, and the unconscious is of unknown extent. It may be infinite. So there's no end to the ways that the self can manifest itself. So we need some criteria. There's this wide range of symbols, so we need criteria. The first criteria is the image is numinous. The second is it unites opposites, and the third is that it's often an image of wholeness. So sometimes, for example, you can see the self appear in the form of a divine child. And in world mythology, there are many divine children. There's the baby Jesus, the baby Buddha, the baby Krishna, the baby Horus, maybe some others, but those are the ones that come to mind. But sometimes in a dream, you see a child, and there's something very special about the dream, about the child. I remember recently one in which the child had intense glowing eyes that seemed to radiate light. It obviously wasn't an ordinary child. That's the self as the divine child who is special in some way. Of course, symbolically pointing to the potentials of the self to develop. The child represents the future potentials of the personality. Or images that unites opposites would be, say, a figure that's both young and old, or a figure that's hermaphroditic, both male and female, or a snake with wings. Excuse me. So a snake, of course, is an earth animal, and the wings suggest upward movement. So a snake with wings would be an example of the self as a complex of opposites. So when you get these opposites, Jung thinks of the self as a complex of opposites, a composite of opposites that are held together or reconciled within it, so that the opposites are not seen as antagonistic, but complementary to each other. So that's the kind of imagery that makes us think that this might be a self symbol. then you can see the self in a dream as an awe-inspiring natural phenomenon, because the self also expresses itself as the natural world. So you might see, for example, a mountain with a golden glow around it. The mountain, of course, symbolically suggesting the linkage of heaven and earth, or an ascent to the spirit, something like that. Or huge trees, gigantic trees, sometimes with a special aura around them, obviously talking about the life principle and the cycle of growth and decay and degeneration. So the self, because it's the totality, you see, it can manifest itself in this huge range of ways, or it can appear in a dream as a powerful storm or a wind, like in the Bible, the presence of God hovering as a spirit hovering over the waters at the beginning of Genesis. The ancient notion of the Spirit of God as a kind of impersonal presence. We also see animal symbolism. For example, recently I saw a dream of a gigantic lion, much larger than an actual lion, not only larger, but also golden and surrounded by this kind of aura of specialness. So there it seems to be expressing the instinctual level of the self. I know this is a very wide range of images, but that's why, but that has to be the case because the self is the totality of the psyche. So it can express itself in this huge range of ways. Sometimes it appears as a voice in a dream, and sometimes even as a waking experience of, what the Quakers call the inner light, an inner voice that seems to know a lot more than the conscious personality. And I mentioned mandala images. Mandalas, again, are geometric figures that express wholeness. Think of the Taoist yin-yang symbol. But they're always combinations of circles, stars, crosses, squares. And Jung thinks they are abstract expressions of the self. He thought this was an important type of self symbol because it represents wholeness and harmony and completion. One of the most important mandala dreams that Jung reports is in Memory Streams Reflections. He had it in 1927. He refers to it in Memories as his Liverpool dream. And the dream was that he was at the center of the city of Liverpool, and there was a square with a central island on which there was a magnificent magnolia tree with reddish blossoms. And the quarters of the city are arranged radially around this central square, forming a mandala. And the central island is blazing with light, but around it, the rest of the city was dirty and cold. It was winter and raining. So I suspect that gloom represented Jung's internal situation at the time, but he's given this image of a numinous center that sustained him. And he says in Memories that this dream felt like an act of grace. And he developed the idea that these kind of mandalas tend to occur at times when the personality is going through a difficult period. They are a sort of part of the self-healing function of the psyche that tries to restore wholeness. And we do see it in psychotherapy occasionally in dreams in the form of mandala imagery, in the form of symmetrical gardens or temples or very symmetrical flowers like roses. Especially to people who are going through a difficult period. It's the psyche seems to try to restore order. So this is obviously very different than the sort of anthropomorphic images of divinity that you see in the theistic traditions. You know how God is referred to as a king or a father or a shepherd. These are anthropomorphic images of God, God described using human characteristics. And Jung thinks that these anthropomorphic God images, God as a divine king or something, are really a projection of the human constitution. And that's why God is imagined as if he has human attributes and emotions. This is not Jung's original idea. It's an old idea. For example, in the 19th century, there was a philosopher called Ludwig Feuerbach, who was an atheist, who tried to dismiss religion by saying that our God image is only nothing but the projection of human values and human nature. So his idea was that what we like in ourselves, we exaggerate and then project that onto our God image in an exaggerated form, as if God was a kind of superhuman creature, infinite rather than finite, immortal rather than mortal, and so on. So for him, this means there's no God. And Freud continues in this, what's called the projective tradition. Freud talks about God as the projection of an exalted father. We feel fragile and helpless, so we look to the sky. We project the need for this heavenly protector, and we call it Heavenly Father. So these projection theorists think they've disproved the existence of God. Actually, they really haven't, of course. What they've done is that they've shown that we color our images of God with parental imagos. And this has been demonstrated by the work of several theorists like Anna Maria Rizzuto, who studied families, and she showed that people's God image often is colored by the way people in their family of origin treated each other. So if people were harsh and cruel, you would tend to have a God image that was harsh and cruel. You tend to have a punitive God image, and so on. So there is something to the projection idea, but it doesn't disprove the existence of God. It means that you may have a God image that's colored by these early family experiences, parental imagos, and so on. What Jung is trying to do, I think, is avoid some of the philosophical problems that are associated with traditional theism. So, for example, if you think of the sort of very classical ways, the classical theistic God image, theistic here means, the traditions that have a creator God, they describe God as omnipotent, omniscient, ubiquitous, all good, superior personality, and so on. But this runs into all kinds of difficulties. For example, they want to insist on a God who's omnipotent and also entirely loving. So they have a problem because of the existence of widespread suffering and evil. The problem is, if you have a God who's omnipotent, that means that God could prevent suffering and evil. Since God is obviously not preventing suffering and evil, how can you say that God is all good? Or if you say that God is all good, maybe you'd have to say that he's not omnipotent, so he cannot prevent suffering and evil. The difficulty is having it both ways. Recently I was watching on the news, people being hauled out of the rubble in the Turkish earthquake alive, and people around them shouting, "God is good," attributing this rescue to the goodness of God, not mentioning the fact that the earthquake itself, the destruction and death that occurred, would be an example of what Jung would call the dark side of God, the side of God that causes destruction and suffering and evil. But many theists don't want to acknowledge, it's one of the major differences between Jung and the theistic traditions. Most of the traditions want to maintain the notion of God as entirely loving and good, and they don't want to acknowledge what Jung describes as the dark side of God, the side that causes these kind of difficulties. I mean, that dark side of God is sometimes acknowledged in the theistic traditions, but not. I'll come back to that if we have some time. So there are other philosophical problems that for example, how can God be both immanent and also transcendent of the world at the same time? Jung doesn't talk about a transcendent level of the self, excuse me. For him, sorry, transcendence means that you're in touch with the objective psyche. I'm sorry, that gives us the experience of transcendence. It's not in some other heavenly realm. Christianity makes the problem of transcendence and immanent very complicated with the doctrine of the incarnation, because there you have a God who is both fully human and fully divine. So they've had difficulty explaining how an infinite God could incarnate, which is a limited, in a limited body, I'm sorry, while also remaining changeless and infinite. That's been a logical difficulty. So, and that's the kind of difficulty that Jung avoids. He doesn't need to speculate about that kind of problem. Theologians, of course, have to, so they fall back on the incomprehensibility of God. They say, well, the nature of God is beyond our cognitive capacities, and they stress the need for faith and so on. But Jung's approach doesn't depend on faith or belief. It's based on these kind of direct experiences that I've been talking about, that if you've had a direct experience of the kind, one of the type of dreams that I've been talking about, it's not a question of belief or faith. You remember that BBC interview, I think it was in 1959 with Friedman, and he asks God, he asks Jung, do you believe in God? And Jung pauses for a moment and says, I don't believe, I know. What he meant by that was that when you've had one of these kind of numinous experiences, it's no longer a question of belief, because you know that you've had the experience. So you don't, in this approach of Jung, you don't need to believe that the biblical stories like the Exodus or the Jesus's miracle stories, which may be purely mythic, you don't need to believe that these are literal history. And you don't need to any of the anthropomorphic God images, God as a king or a shepherd or something. You simply pay attention to the way the self manifests itself to you as an individual. If you're familiar with process theology, you might recognize the idea in process theology that they say that God is only absolute in some respects and still in the process of evolving. And this is very similar to the idea in Jung that these God images that I've been talking about don't stay still, they transform over time. He says in a letter that as we go more and more into the unconscious, we will come across more and more of this kind of imagery which transforms our God image. I'll give you an idea of what that looks like in practice. A woman, I mentioned before that we project our parental images onto our God image. So I'm thinking of a woman who had a rather punitive, difficult father. And she had a God image that was like that you had to be very careful how you behaved. God is punitive. God demands high standards and so on and so on. So, and that was exactly like her father. So she has a dream in which she's hook, like a fish hook, comes down from above and hooks her through the chest and lifts her up and suspends her, so she's hanging helplessly on this hook. And she looks down and she sees a figure dressed in white robes, white hair and a white beard and so on, and he's pointing a huge cannon at her. And then he fires this cannon at her and she can't get out of the way. And she realizes that this is God. This figure is God, and she's completely helpless. She can't get out of the way. Now, this is an image of a very punitive God image who can do what he wants. We are kind of helpless, sort of divine victims would be the traditional phrase. So she then works on her father difficulty in ordinary kind of psychotherapeutic way. And then years later, she has another dream in which she's led into a large hall. And in this hall, there are images and statues and icons of all the world's religious traditions. And she's led around and she's told that she can have any one she wants. And the one she's interested in, that she's drawn to, is a statue of the laughing Buddha. He was an 8th or 9th century Zen monk. I think his name was Hote or Pote or something like that. But the point about him is that he's joyful. He has a big smile. He has a great big belly. He has a bag of goodies for the children, big ears because he listens, and so on. But none of that punitive quality of her previous God image. That's what Jung means by the transformation of the God image. It's kind of a process notion that the image of God can change as we go more and more into the unconscious. Now, whether that transformation is I suspect it's only referring to the images that we have. We can't say whether it refers to the divine itself, which is changing, but certainly, which I think the process theologians would say, from a psychological point of view, we can say that the images change as we pay more and more attention to them. And we all develop a God image fairly early on because we absorb it from the family and the culture. But in the Red Book, Jung writes that a new consciousness of the divine is being born in the human soul, although against some resistance. And resistance, of course, is inevitable because it's not easy to give up the traditional God images. We're attached to them. We've been taught them since childhood. They were kind of drummed into us in the family and in Sunday school. And we're told what God is like according to a tradition. But I think what Jung has done is developed an alternative to these traditional God images. And I think we're really thanks to Jung, we're on the cusp of this new mythic image. And this is necessary because we have a different consciousness than the original founders of the theistic traditions. If you think of a group of bishops in the 4th century, say the Council of Nicaea, sitting around a table trying to come up with an agreed upon God image that would be acceptable to the Emperor Constantine. I mean, we have an entirely different consciousness. We have to take into account areas like quantum physics, cosmology, which, of course, those people had no inkling of. So we need new God images. Now, the idea that the divine is born, as Jung says in the Red Book, within the soul of the individual, was not his original idea. I think he saw it in Meister Eckhart. But for Jung, this means that a new awareness of the divine is developing within the psyche as we pay attention to this kind of imagery. And he would say it's mediated to consciousness by the soul. He uses the soul in two senses. One is the soul as the total psyche, a straight translation of the word psyche. But also sometimes he uses the word soul as a receiver and transmitter, a kind of organ in psyche that allows us to perceive these deep unconscious contents. So the soul is a kind of bridge between the ego and these otherwise inaccessible transpersonal depths of the psyche. The soul is the creator of symbols and images, that bridge to consciousness in what he calls the transcendent function. As I said before, so whatever is the local name for God carries the projection of the self. So for Christians, Christ would be a symbolic representation of the self. But for Jung, Christ is an incomplete symbol of the self. Because, first of all, it's exclusively light and spiritualized and good and loving, and also it's exclusively male. So it doesn't include the dark side of the self, the side of the self that Job experienced when Job experienced terrible suffering at the behest of the divine. So if you think that God is only good, as many Christians do, only good and loving, you have to project evil either onto the devil or the Antichrist, or you have to project evil onto human beings, who are then the only source of evil. So Jung complained that the image of God as a trinity excludes the dark side of God. It also excludes matter and the feminine aspects of the divine. So Jung felt that a Trinitarian God image is really incomplete. And that we have to find the sacred in matter or in the body, and we have to recognize the divine feminine. That's why he thought that the dogma of the Assumption of Mary, I think that was 1950, proclaimed in 1950, I think by Pius XII, I can't remember exactly. But the dogma said that she was taken up body and soul into heaven. So now she is the Queen of Heaven. It's a kind of modern development of the idea of the hieros gamos, of the sacred marriage of the male and female divinities, as it were. And he thought this was important because it added a feminine element to what was otherwise an exclusively masculine God image. And Jung thought that the appearance of this dogma was evidence that revelation continues. And in fact, this is one of the main differences between Jung and many of the theistic traditions that believe that revelation has stopped. Jung thought that every time you have one of these kinds of numinous experiences that I've been describing, they are personal forms of revelation. Whereas many of the traditions would not accept that. If you think that revelation occurred at Mount Sinai or in the incarnation in Christ, that there was no further revelation after that. But Jung thinks that revelation is continuing every time you have one of these kinds of experiences. Well, there are, I think the Mormons think that the revelation can continue. Anyway, Jung also thought that among the alchemists, the Christ figure was compensated for with the figure that the alchemists called Mercurius. He represents the chthonic spirit of the unconscious, the spirit in matter, or the light of nature, the spirit within the darkness of the unconscious, the intangible spirit within the unconscious. So Jung thought that Christ and Mercurius are both symbols of the self. The Christ figure is spiritualized. The Mercurius figure is the spirit in matter. And that it's instinctual or bodily, and that for the sake of wholeness, we have to bring both these complementary dimensions together in our God image, recognizing that spirit and matter are all aspects of a totality. So for Jung, remember that one of the central ideas in Jung is the notion that the psyche is ontologically real. It's a domain, it exists, it's a domain in its own right. It is not reducible to the brain. In mainstream psychology and neuroscience today, a lot of people think that the mind or the psyche is simply sort of an excretion or an epiphenomenon of the brain. The brain makes the mind. But Jung would say, no, you cannot reduce the psyche to the brain. He's much more in touch with people like William James, who wrote about he called it the transmission theory, the transmission theory of consciousness, or something like that. And the idea is that the brain is an organ that transmits consciousness, that allows us to experience consciousness. It doesn't generate consciousness. So the psyche is a domain in its own right. And it's only so that when we have an experience of the self in one of these ways, it's an experience of something real. That's the main point. You can't dismiss it as nothing but a dream, as if that means it wasn't real, because the psyche is a real domain in its own right. And the psyche is the organ of experience. So the only way we can experience anything is by means of a psychic image. Now, there's another way that the manifestations of the self are not confined to the intrapsychic manifestations. They also appear in the outer world in the form of synchronistic events. So you remember that synchronicity is Jung's term for the meaningful coincidence of a physical event in the outer world and something in the subject's psychological state, even though there's no causal connection between the inner and the outer. So for example, let's say you dream of a plane crash, you wake up the next morning and you see in the paper that there's been a plane crash. So obviously there's a physical event and a psychological event, and they have the same meaning, but they're not causally connected. The one didn't cause the other. So that's what's meant by synchronicity. So Jung thinks that these events are evidence for an underlying unitary level of reality, which he refers to in the medieval language as the unus mundus, or one world. He thinks that there's some deep level of reality out of which spirit and matter, or matter and psyche, arises. At this level, that what you could call the non-dual level of the unus mundus, the psyche and the physical world are aspects of a whole. And then they emerge into consciousness, sometimes in the form of synchronistic events. And when you have a synchronistic event, the event gives us a very intense experience of meaning, objective meaning. There's an argument about whether the meaning is something that we make up, or whether the meaning is what Jung calls self-subsistent meaning, that the meaning is given in the event. It's objective meaning. There's some debate about that. But the point is, the meaning is so intense that we realize that we belong to a deeper level of reality than we normally perceive. In other words, and so the self is the ground of this kind of experience. So the self is not just an intrapsychic phenomenon. Now, von Franz talks about a different type of synchronicity that she describes as the social function of the self. This is in her book on projection and recollection in Jungian psychology. She says that each person gathers round themselves what she calls a soul family. That is, that we gather around us a group of people not created by accident, but through a deeper sort of essential spiritual interest that she calls reciprocal individuation, that you gather together with people with whom you belong. These relationships would be like a group like this, or a dream group, or something like that. She says these relationships have objective meaning. They are synchronistically created in a mysterious way by the self, so that you are brought together with people with whom you belong. There's another very interesting way in which Jung is now linking to this notion of the unus mundus, or a unitary level of reality, is appearing in quantum mechanics. So Jung, in the idea of the unus mundus, is that there's a realm of unity and wholeness, which is the absolute level of the self prior to its differentiation within ordinary time and space. This is an old idea. In antiquity, it was called the pleroma. And then again, in the medieval era, it was called the unus mundus. Anyway, it reappeared in quantum mechanics in the form of what the physicist David Bohm called the implicate order. He says that at a deep quantum level, there's a realm of unbroken wholeness. In that realm, which he calls the implicate order, there is no division and no borders. Everything is connected. This is a common ground of matter and consciousness. It may correspond to what Jung calls the psychoid dimension. And Bohm says that the level of our everyday reality, which seems to consist of separately existing objects, Bohm calls that the explicate order. So what Bohm refers to as the implicate order, I think, corresponds to what Jung calls the self. And the granular level that we experience is the everyday level in which everything is separate. So it's very interesting that this notion of wholeness and completion at a deep level appeared in modern quantum mechanics. It's synonymous with the realm of the self as the totality before it incarnates into the empirical personality. So what I'm suggesting is that contemporary society needs some kind of container for our spirituality, but very often traditional religions don't work. And the evidence for that is the steady decline in church attendance in many denominations. That there is a deep human longing for contact with the transpersonal dimension. But you can only meet the need for a spiritual life by contact with the spirit. You cannot meet that need by being told what to believe. If you're sitting in a building reading a book about what happened to somebody else, like a biblical story, that's what William James called second-hand religion. What Jung is talking about is the ability to express our personal experience of the sacred without any recourse to traditional doctrine and dogma. And Jung thinks this is very important because the world has, with a modern term for it, has become disenchanted. Jung didn't use that word, but he felt that we had lost our connection to spirit, and that there was a cultural problem of meaninglessness because we've lost our connection to a spiritual center. But we can find that spiritual center by paying attention to our dream imagery. Furthermore, using Jung's approach, it's no longer necessary to think about the divine in terms of the chosen people or people who were saved. Um, these are sort of antiquated ways of thinking about the relationship between the divine and the human dimension. The divine and the human dimension are depicted in Jungian psychology as the ego-self axis, the relationship between the ego and manifestations of the self. So this is an appealing alternative for people who call themselves spiritual but not religious. Now, as I mentioned briefly before, Jung got into trouble with the theologians who complained that he'd overstepped the boundaries between theology and psychology. So a good example of that was Martin Buber, who accused Jung of what's called psychologism, as if Jung was saying that God is nothing but a content of the psyche, rather than a transcendent being. And Buber thought that was too reductive. But Jung could never persuade Buber that when he was talking about these intrapsychic images, he's talking about something real. Buber wanted to maintain the idea of some kind of being beyond the psyche, transcendent of the psyche. And he could never understand Jung's notion that when you have one of these images, it's an experience of something real. So if the psyche is real, images of the self are real. But Jung would say the theologians like Buber are just talking about a realm of divinity that's absolutely unknowable. All the metaphysical assertions about the nature of the divine really are nothing more than metaphysical assertions, which Jung thinks are themselves statements of the psyche. There's no way to prove or disprove them. But the question of proof or disproof doesn't arise when we're talking about these dream symbols. Buber also didn't like Jung's idea that the self could have a light side and a dark side, which causes good and evil. And the other theologians didn't like this idea as well. Victor White, the English Dominican theologian, visited Zurich and tried to establish some compatibility between Catholic theology and depth psychology, but the attempt really failed because White couldn't accept Jung's notion that there is a dark side of the divine that causes evil and suffering. So in that way, many people said that Jung's approach is really incompatible with traditional Christian theology. Jung also got in trouble with the psychoanalysts. For example, the Freudian tradition always accused Jung of being a mystic and not a real psychologist because of his interest in this kind of material. Erich Fromm wrote that it's a mistake to see the unconscious as a source of religious experience or a source of revelation. The unconscious is just part of the psyche. It has nothing to do with spirituality. Apparently, he just couldn't wrap his head around the idea that this kind of imagery is a product of the unconscious. So I think I'd better spend a little bit of time about talking about Answer to Job and the notion of the dark side of the self. But maybe before I do so, this would be a good time to see if there are any questions before I go on with this. Would this be okay if we take some questions at this point? Or comments or questions?
Linda has a question.
Yeah.
Unmute, yeah.
Dr. Corbett,
Yeah.
I'm not sure I can connect these dots very well, but today, the last couple of days, there's been a lot in the media about what's happening with AI, artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And people are starting to interact with it. Is it echo? Am I creating an echo? And some of these interactions, they seem to be humanizing themselves. Humanizing is not the right word. anthropomorphizing themselves, giving themselves human characteristics. And I just wonder what would Jung say about this direction that we are taking, where we are joining ourselves with technology, something that's not human.
I think he would see it as coming out of the ego level, because the self is really transpersonal. It's a different domain than the ego level. So you're not in an artificial intelligence, you're not going to find the self, Jung's self. It's not going to. It could make up an experience, but it wouldn't be something that spontaneously occurs to it the way these kind of images occur to us through the psyche.
Do you see that, or would he see that as a dangerous development for humanity?
I think it's too early to tell, honestly. It depends how it develops.
And is there a connection for you with what you're talking to us about tonight and that direction that we're taking?
Well, the artificial intelligence would be part of what Jung calls the spirit of the times. You remember in the Red Book, he distinguishes between the spirit of the depths and the spirit of the times. The spirit of the times is the egoic level of everyday experience. And the spirit of the depth is what we experience when we pay attention to the unconscious. And I think that anything that comes out of human intelligence would be part of the spirit of the times. I mean, if you were to ask an artificial intelligence, do you experience the divine? I don't know what it would say, but that might be an interesting question.
Yeah, I think it is an interesting question. Anyway, thank you for responding to that.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question, but I'm not sure of the answer, actually. But that's what I would say so far. In the chat, okay, so there's, would you like to comment on the use of psychedelics? Yeah, how this relates to images of deity or the numinous. Yeah, this is an important question. Les Stein in Australia and I are just editing a book on this very topic. The question is whether when you have a use of psychedelic, like psilocybin or LSD or ayahuasca or something like that, are you just experiencing sort of screwed up brain chemistry, or is it really opening the door to an authentic spiritual experience? Which is what the tribal cultures believe. They call these the plants of the gods. They think these plants like psilocybin mushrooms were put here so we could communicate with them with the other level. So that's an ongoing debate. And people like Stan Grof, who did a lot of the original research in this area, do acknowledge that Jungian psychology is very helpful in understanding some of the material that emerges when people use psychedelics, because what they do is they sort of open the psyche up to other realms of experience. Jung himself was not keen on the use of these compounds. He thought that the problem, in several letters, he writes that he thinks you get too much information that cannot be integrated. And that when you're in touch with the unconscious in this kind of way, you have a moral responsibility to try to integrate the material that emerges, and there's too much. The dream image is sort of relatively limited. But, you know, a psilocybin session lasts several hours. You can't possibly, he thought, assimilate. Well, he used mescaline as the example. He said you can't possibly assimilate all that kind of, he thought it was too artificial an approach to the unconscious. But I think that's a little bit of an outdated view. I think many people nowadays think that what has to happen is if people have one of these experiences, pardon me, that the task of psychotherapy is to help the person integrate the experience. Excuse me. And that Jungian psychology is very valuable because we know a good deal about the archetypal level of the psyche, which is where those compounds take us to. So I think Jungian therapists are going to either use these compounds or help people integrate the experience.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes,
here.
yes.
Yeah, me too.
Yes.
To the last point, the one of the founders of Alcoholics Anonymous, Bill Wilson, suggested that the difference between what he refers to as a spiritual experience and impact of hallucinogen taken by is the transformative character of a spiritual experience, whereas the experience induced by hallucinogens usually are temporary and don't necessarily have a lasting effect. Whether that is so or not, I can't really answer. I have another quick question briefly, because you talked.
By the way, forgive me interrupting. That also was one of Jung's critiques, that it's too temporary. Sorry, go on with it.
Well, my question is with respect to the imagery that you have mentioned often in terms of these numinous experiences, such as the all-seeing eye or mandalas, etc. I mean, I just want to suggest from my personal experience, I know I've had one of those experiences and in awake state, and I do not recall any visuals with it, and yet it was such an experience. The only thing I can associate with the visual aspect of this experience was that the falling away of everything that was visual around me, with all of my senses being almost like bundled like in a laser beam to an event which was initiated by music, actually.
Sorry, initiated by what? Music?
By music, by a piece of music. I was in a classical concert. I was totally, I had, as you described earlier, a negative experience before coming in there. I had soaked in the rain. I sat down. I wasn't particularly interested or ready for this concert. And upon the start of a particular piece of music, I was overcome by, like, as I said, everything falling apart. My whole focus, like almost in a laser beam, focused on these sensations of this music. And it's really impossible to describe it in detail, but the result was an overcoming. I was overcome by awe, complete awe in hearing it, and a sense of well-being, to the point that I could hear myself comment on the experience silently, that now I can die. I've experienced it all, I've seen it all. And then for about 48 hours, I could not talk. I could not communicate this experience with anyone. So what I'm suggesting, I guess, is that whatever our senses, whatever senses give us access, they don't have to be just visual. Would that be accurate?
No, you're quite right. I mean, what you experience, thank you for telling us, is a very powerful experience, I would say, of the unit, the sense of the self as the totality of reality. And it's often triggered by a powerful experience. Music is one of them. Anything that reduces the hegemony of the ego, anything that sort of makes the ego less in control, will open us to really, and that level, of course, is there all the time. We're just not usually open to it. I mean, that's a beautiful mystical experience of the self as the totality. And it is a gift, and it lasts a lifetime. And
I see it as such.
That sense that you now I can die is very common
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
now you know. You see, it's not a question of faith or belief.
Mhm.
Nobody could tell you that didn't happen. You know it.
Yes.
That's Jung's point.
Mhm.
Well, thank you very much for telling us that. I wonder if other people would be willing to share an experience like that. I don't know if anybody would, but
May I go ahead with a question if there is somebody who wants to do that?
please,
And we can raise we can raise hands in the chat box down below or the reactions box to get in line. But continuing on the idea that you started with, where you brought out the numinous, opposites united, and wholeness as really a core to the entire discussion that we've had so far. But so my question is, when is it? And I always use the words incorrectly in non-teleologic cosmogony. Where does it come when we don't have a system of belief inside that's this Western culture oriented? So the question is, what do we know of the dreams, numinous, opposites united, wholeness dreams that come from Asia and Africa, from those other cultures? Do we have any idea? And does it speak in a different way than what we've been talking about, which to me is largely Christian?
Yeah. This is an important point because you remember that Jung thinks the objective psyche is below the personal unconscious, and it's common to all human beings. All human beings participate in this level. So it's not surprising that imagery from a religious tradition that you know nothing about may appear in your dreams. So maybe you grew up, let's say, in a Western Christian culture. You could dream of a Hindu or an Egyptian god or goddess, because we all, in principle, we all have access to that level, and it can manifest itself in dreams. So when it happens, I once had a dream in which the Egyptian god Anubis appeared to me. He had a human body and a dog's head or jackal's head or something like that. So when you get, and I didn't know what the heck it was. Now, when you get that kind of image, you have to research what are the specific characteristics of that figure. Why does the unconscious think that figure is important to you? But in principle, any kind of mythic image can appear.
If that's an example of an African, what is a Chinese dream? Do we know anything about Chinese dreams in the culture where there are non-teleologic, not a sense that it's a world where you have to have some relationship to for peace, but it's not directed in the way that we think of it in Western?
Sorry, I didn't understand that part of your question.
My question was, the image you brought up of a head seems to be maybe centered from Africa. Do we know, do we have any images centered from China?
Oh, no, I mean, I meant it literally. You could get an image from any culture in the world. You could, I work with a lot of Chinese people, and they get gods and goddesses from everywhere. And I've known a few Westerners who've had Chinese material in their dreams. So that's the whole point about the objective psyche, you see. It's not denominational. You know what I mean? It's the self is not interested in these arbitrary distinctions. Let me go on with other questions, please.
Faye has her hand up.
Yes. Hi, I'm Faye. I had an experience to share, and it's wonderful to be able to share it here because I've written about it. I've shared it with therapists, but I've never shared it aloud like this. I was studying here. I was studying a lot of Kundalini yoga at one point, and I was and I had been ill. I'd been sick, and I hadn't been eating very well, and I was overcome, for lack of a better term, one night with the energy coursing through me. There were no substances involved, and I found myself moving into the different poses that I saw, with that I had I had seen, and I thought they were just poses. I thought they were actually just poses. You know, the women, they do their arms different ways. And I started doing that. And what I realized was, as I was doing it, what I was doing was directing the coursing of the energy through my body in different ways.
Yeah, that's
And so it was the reality of what I think they were doing in those poses. And it really doesn't matter because it was happening to me. And so I worked with it for a good long time. My body would not stop moving. And then at one point I was just sitting there kind of, and then the energy was coming through, and I was in a web. And I was able to jump from one intersection of the web to the other. And every time I jumped, I had a different view of reality. So it was as if I was surrounded by this sphere. Anyway, that is it very quickly. I'm happy to be.
That latter experience is archetypally depicted in Indra's web.
Right. I learned that later.
Later, yeah. Well, we get these experiences from mythologies that we don't know about. And the spontaneous mudras is very interesting. I haven't heard that before, but I would describe that as the energy of the self moving the body when the ego is temporarily suspended. And the energy is so intense that the body can't contain it without moving. And maybe that's how these mudras were arrived at. I don't know. That's a very interesting question. But your body must be quite sensitive to this kind of energy.
Right. Especially then it was. I've had to move away from that because as I'm sure you know, the experiences can turn, and when one is in the outside world, they can kind of turn, and they become as wondrous as it was, and as wonderful as it was. I did not put myself in the position to have that level of body sensitivity again.
Yeah. Well, it can be frightening. Sometimes you can't resist this stuff. It just happens.
I couldn't resist it. It did not become frightening until a couple of days later.
That's why we call it the autonomous psyche. The ego has no control. It does what it wants.
It did. It did.
Thank you. Very interesting experience.
Lynn Cohen has a question.
All right. Oh, Lynn, is it?
Yeah. You touched on this. I was just going to ask you to expand a little more on the religious belief that one's religious belief is the only right religious belief, and I guess how that connects to xenophobia. And that was my basic question.
You're talking about what I describe as religious narcissism. You know, where you use your religious tradition to support your own sense of self, to make yourself feel important or special. You know, we're saved or chosen and you're not. You know, somehow we're better, you know, that kind of thing. That's what I call religious narcissism. It's a pernicious habit that all the traditions do. You know, my God image is better than yours, you know, that kind of thing, which is really nonsense, of course, because they're all emerging from the objective psyche. So there's no need for this murderous competition that we see historically between the monotheisms. The imagery in their sacred text is all coming out of the objective psyche. It's meaningless to say that one is more true than another. I think that's a pathological form of religion when you start using it to make yourself feel better than other people. Anyway, I hope, does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you.
We have more. Let me, can I look at the chat and see?
We don't have any other hands up, so it looks
Okay,
like.
so somebody in the chat says, can we move on to Answer to Job? Okay, so let's do that. Excuse me. So Jung's Answer to Job, one of his later books, it examines how the biblical book of Job transformed, Jung thinks, transformed the collective, the canonical Judeo-Christian image of God. So very briefly, for people who are not familiar with this story, the story of Job is about an apparently innocent, pious man who suffers terribly for no obvious reason. It's an archetypal image of the suffering of the innocent, which of course is still with us, and it's found in many traditions. The story begins between God and a member of the heavenly court. And this, what's called a Satan, not the later devil of the tradition, but the member of the court says that Job is only good and pious because God has given him so much. Job is very affluent, very influential, very important in the community. And so this figure says to God, I think if you were to take all that away from him, he wouldn't be so good and pious. So God allows Job to suffer tremendous losses, apparently as a test of faith. His children, his house, the house that his children are in falls down. I forget if he has 7 or 10 children, and they're all killed. And then all his flocks of animals are all stolen. So all of a sudden he loses everything. So in Answer to Job, Jung says that it's as if the figure of Yahweh, who allows all this suffering to happen, is unconscious of his own dark side, manifested by this cruel treatment of Job, which he didn't really deserve. And Jung points out that, I'm sort of paraphrasing the book, that the biblical image of Yahweh in the book of Job is a mixture of positive and negative qualities, anger, love, all existing side by side. And what happens is that in the story, Job insists that he didn't deserve what had happened to him. He hadn't done anything so terrible to warrant all this suffering. And that forced Yahweh to become conscious of his shadow aspects, of his dark side that causes suffering and evil. Also, it's as if Yahweh is projecting his doubts about, he's projecting his doubts about his own faithfulness about his own faithfulness onto Job. He's wondering if Job is faithful. In fact, he's the one, Yahweh is the one that's not faithful. Okay. Jung says that this behavior towards Job, who didn't deserve all this suffering, is atrocious. So the notion of God as the summum bonum, the ultimate good or the highest good, can no longer be maintained. God is a paradox that represents all the qualities of creation, all the good and negative qualities in creation. Everything that exists, including evil, is a function of its creator. I'm sort of paraphrasing Jung, if you think that God is only good, as many Christians do, then all evil has to originate in human beings, forgetting, Jung says, that the serpent is present in the Garden of Eden right at the beginning of creation. And then human beings become a scapegoat for all evil, and that's an overly pessimistic view of human nature. And that, Jung thinks, doesn't grant evil an objective status. It doesn't do justice to the enormity of evil. If you make a traditional figure like Christ only good, the devotees of Christ have to carry all the darkness. They're responsible for all evil. And Christian theology has tried to do that. It's tried to impose this notion of intrinsic human sinfulness on the Western tradition. And Christianity has said that this human sinfulness impedes our direct relationship with a transcendent God, so that we need the mediation of Christ. This is a very radical distinction than Jung's approach, which says that the human psyche has an intrinsic capacity to relate to the self because there is a God image in the psyche. So you have an innate presence of the divine in the psyche, which is where the divine and the human meet. You don't need to have an external mediator. You don't need a sacred text. You don't need a church hierarchy or institution or anything like that. So Jung goes on to say that the story of Job is a paradigm for the idea that human consciousness is necessary for the divine to become conscious of unknown parts of itself. Because it was human consciousness that made the Yahweh figure become conscious of its own dark side. So Jung is postulating a partially unconscious God, which really offended a lot of theologians who want to maintain the idea that God is only good and loving. You see, Jung is objecting to a Christian idea that Augustine promoted, called that evil is what he called the privatio boni, or the privation of good, or the absence of good. In other words, the idea was that evil is not something substantial, that it's really an absence. But Jung said that can't be the case. If evil is not substantial, then how can goodness be substantial? And how can you have a Christian devil if evil is not substantial? What St. Augustine is trying to do is avoid this Manichaean idea of two ultimate principles, one evil and one good. So Jung addresses that problem by saying that good and evil are different aspects of the self. The self contains all the opposites. Jung thinks that what happened, that the answer to Job was the incarnation in Christ. It was as if Job, who now represents humanity, had reached a level of development which was greater than the Yahweh image of the story. So God had to incarnate in Christ in order, as it were, for the image of God to catch up with where human beings, with the level of moral development that human beings had attained. So this led to a radical change in the canonical God image, from the sort of warlike God of the Hebrew Bible to the God of love in the Christian tradition. That Jung thinks that had to happen because of the story of Job. Now, many Christians don't like the idea of the dark side of God. They say, I don't experience that. I only encounter a loving God. And it's an essential part of the Christian tradition to say that God is love. I think it's the first letter of John that says he is only light, and in him there is no darkness. So they see evil as a kind of rebellion against love. So that the idea that God could have a dark side that causes suffering, like Job experienced, in other words, God does not just love us, is quite frightening to a lot of people. You remember that Jung thought, you remember in Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he says he had an intimation of the dark side of God when he had this childhood vision or internal image of God. I think he was 11 or 12 years old. In the vision, God is sitting on his throne, and a gigantic turd falls down from below the throne and crashes through the roof of the Basel Cathedral. And he said this gave him an immense sense of relief, and it felt like an illumination. Now, of course, in the Freudian tradition, they say that's just an Oedipal rebellion against his father, because his father's a minister in the Christian church. So it's like an Oedipal attack on his father. But I think that for Jung, it was a vision of the dark side of God that is not interested in these denominational differences. His father, you see, his father, who was a minister in the Swiss Reformed Church, had never had a numinous experience. His father had relied on belief in doctrine and dogma, and it didn't work for him. He was preaching, but he hadn't had a direct experience, and the preaching and the theory, the theology, wasn't enough. It didn't work for him. So his father was chronically unhappy and died at a rather young age. Now, the Hebrew Bible has many mythic examples of the dark side of God, where you see Yahweh promoting destruction and mass murder and war and famine and pestilence. And Isaiah, and God says through Isaiah, I make weal and create woe. And there are lots of lamentations in the Psalms about God's bad behavior. But many Christians just only want to see God as loving and benevolent. You do see it in the Christian Bible, in the dark side of the divine and the divine, in the avenging angels of the book of Revelation. But you don't see much of it in the Christian tradition. So I think Jung's notion of the dark side of God is really incompatible with the Christian image of an all-good God. Are there any comments about that? How does it strike you? Does it seem like a frightening idea to think that God could cause suffering and evil as well as... Yes, please, Andrew.
Andrew,
Andrew?
you're muted.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was trying to figure it out.
Yeah, you got it. You
Apologies.
got it. But you've got your video turned off.
I'll turn it on.
Okay.
Thank you. This has been a really good meeting. I actually really like that end part because I'm reading a book called the Kybalion. I think I'm saying that right. And it talks about the different laws of human, not human, but how the laws of the universe work. And when you spoke about how God could potentially be evil, that made me think of the law of correspondence, and you've already talked about it, as above, so below.
Yeah.
And that it makes sense that in this God that we have always, I'm sure a lot of us were religious in our upbringing, maybe not all of us, but a majority if we're from the United States, and I was. And like you said, you really just get a glimpse of his divinity and how great he is. But I even questioned that a few years ago of, okay, well, if God is so good, then why is everything evil? And this is, you just strike a good point with, if there's a light, there has to be dark, and there has to be, that's why the whole premise of the shadow self, and it was a good refresher. So
Yes, thank you. But you see, you can attribute evil and suffering to human beings. You could say it's either just like the process theologians say, there are aspects of reality that God is not in charge of. So maybe things like the earthquakes just happen for no supernatural reason. Or you could say that the rest of the evil, what's called moral evil, is always due to human beings and never due to God. So that's why a lot of people don't like Jung's idea. But anyway, thanks for your comments. Yeah.
Alan, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I'll just say that, I was raised Catholic and confirmed in the church, and I still find a lot to admire about it. But one thing that sort of unconsciously bothered me growing up under the church as a kid was there was a moment in the Mass on Sunday mornings where the priest it was a moment where the entire congregation got really quiet and the priest would say, "Let us pray."
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be dead silent, like hundreds and hundreds of people in this big church, just absolutely quiet. And I'd start to go within. And then before I could summon the least bit of thought, the priest's voice would come booming out, and he would be the one to determine what you were praying. He would say the prayer that you were supposed to internalize. And I just thought, I wish there could be some kind of transformation where we didn't have such a mediator speaking for us. This is my middle-aged self looking back. But I would love to continue to see a transformation of religion where instead of the priest determining what you're praying as a spiritual middleman, that there's more of that silence in this beautiful Mass. There's more of that going within and more of a personal communion with God.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's very important. What you said reminded me of a crack of Jung's. He says that one of the functions of organized religion is to prevent people having a religious experience, because the sort of authoritarian traditions want to contain people's spirituality within their own story, within their own rituals and sacraments and so on. And they don't want any deviation. And one of the problems with Jung's approach that people have said to me is that you could have a dream image that actually contradicts received doctrine and dogma. That's why the church doesn't like the mystics. The mainstream church is not happy with mystics because the mystics, they get it straight from the head office, as it were. They may get something which is not official. So, mysticism is a bit of a problem for the established church.
Dr. Corbett and Amanda Palin has a very interesting response to this related to the feminine. I wonder if she's here and she can amplify what she put up on the chat.
I didn't see it. Let's see. Can I go to the chat?
Is she here, I wonder?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I can read her point.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I do feel the fear of that perspective, just in the not so simple realization that suffering is part of life. I wonder if this is perhaps where the feminine can be a change agent or assisting with the holding of that fear. Meaning our relationship with life-death cycles. Is Amanda here? Maybe.
I'm here. Yes, I'm here. I don't know if you can hear me.
We can.
I can hear her. I can't see you.
Yeah, and I'm still forming this thought in my mind and just making connections to what you were mentioning.
Yeah.
Earlier about even just the symbol of like the square or the cube.
But why do you say the feminine can be a change agent? I mean, or assisting with the, I'm not sure. You mean because the feminine is a container somehow?
Yeah, maybe it's not just limited to the feminine. I think there's maybe a lot of things that could be helpful containers for really deep subjects like this. But I think that I feel this more personally in my own dreams, that the feminine tends to show up in that way whenever I am experiencing just deep fear, suffering of some kind. The feminine shows up in that way if I am allowing or willing to look at the image of the dream and amplify that as something that's there to assist me in holding it in a different light, I guess.
Well, dreams do that, but I think it's perhaps not always the feminine that does that.
I agree. Just a thought. It's just maybe one of the thoughts that I'm connecting personally. I just remember you saying something about like the image of squares or cubes, earth symbols of stability and wholeness.
Yeah.
Order, limits, form. I'm just thinking, like earth goddesses or earth deities or gods. It doesn't have to be feminine, but yeah. I'm just curious. I don't know if any of that's making sense, but I'm curious about that.
I think it's very individual. I think, there's the idea, like in the book of Job, where Job asks God for help with God. So if Jung is right that the self has a dark side that causes suffering, and then when you pay attention to your dreams or your complexes that are causing suffering, you are essentially asking God for help with God. Mm-hmm. So it may show up in a feminine way, but it may show up in other ways. I think if it's relevant to you, you stay with the way it appears to you.
I see Lynn has a question. And Gail, did you have a question? Maybe Lynn and then Gail? Lynn, you're muted. Or was that earlier, Lynn?
No, this is a new one. I was curious. I understand what you're saying about organized religion. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if you see a value to a concrete way of shared experience that does not shared spiritual experience that does not dictate what those practices are. Maybe that's the best way to put it.
I didn't quite follow your question. Could you restate it?
Yeah. I understand what you're saying about organized religion. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there's a value to a concrete way of shared spiritual experience, and if so, what you might envision that as being.
Well, for example, a dream group that pays attention to this kind of material, I think, is a shared spiritual experience, because I think working with dreams is a spiritual practice, because the self is the maker of dreams. So it is a spiritual practice. So I think as much as possible, we should be in dream groups. And groups like this, where people are willing to share these kind of experiences, because there's nowhere you can go except in the Jungian community to talk about this stuff.
Great response. And Gail, did you have something?
I did, and I hope I can put this clearly into words, but if we are to trust that the psyche, the self, with the capital S, is presenting us with material in our dreams, for example, that come in the service of wholeness, how does that jive with the divine image that is that paradox of good and evil, all encompassing? That's a lot to reconcile or.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
Paradox is exactly the right word.
Any words of wisdom about that?
when you are going through a difficult period of suffering and so on, if you can think about it as an experience of the dark side of the self, that it's actually driven by the dark side of the self, it makes a difference. It's better than thinking of it as just random, suffering for no reason.
I may I? I read something a while back about an effort of various spiritual traditions and various world religions to come up with a definition that they could all agree on. And if I recall this correctly, the one expression that all these religious traditions and world religions could agree on was as God, representing God as ultimate reality.
Mm-hmm.
When I hear ultimate reality, that for me at least would include it all. That it would include the evil. That would include, whatever we consider good.
Mhm.
It just be the all, right?
I agree. Some people like that approach. That was sort of Tillich's approach, but some people think it's too impersonal, you see.
Mhm.
The more you get away from the anthropomorphisms, like the Heavenly Father, Shepherd, King imagery, the more you go to a more absolute level, like absolute reality, ultimate reality, the less personal your God image becomes. And then in some of the Eastern traditions, you see, the divine is entirely impersonal. So you have to strike a balance, I think, depending on your temperament, whether you want a more personal God image, in which case the dream imagery is important, or whether you're happy with an absolute God image.
Tom Camp had a continuation of the sense of the feminine. Tom, do you want to read what you've written on the?
Just that for me, one of the things the feminine represents, not all of it, but is the vulnerability and the sense that we go to organized religion to support our egos, to support a sense of self, and the feminine opens us to the reality that we are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
We will die. There is evil. There is that which is against us, as well as that which is for us. And that's kind of scary. And just one other quick comment to what you just said about in my old age, I've just forgotten exactly what I was going to say. But anyway, it was good.
Okay, that's all. Maybe it'll come back to you.
Yeah.
There's a comment from Faye saying, I'm willing to share an experience.
That comment was from before, and I did share my experience.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So thanks.
I didn't catch your name. Sorry.
Right,
Okay.
that's okay.
Yeah.
And Amanda Palin, who had brought up the feminine issue to begin with, said, yes, I love that, Tom Camp. It was a good depth he was having from that. I thought you had asked, what are our reactions when you talked about answer to Job and that the issue that he comes to at the end, challenging God. And what came to my mind, Dr. Corbett, is the answer to the ending of Matter of Heart, where von Franz has talked about a fearful aspect. She said she read what Jung's notes were as he died, and she couldn't take it. She read them and shut the drawer, is what she, when we filmed the interview to her, that's what she said. It was so dire. It was such a devastating destruction that he was talking about, that she was afraid to deal with it. But to bring it up to our times, what she also said is that being alone, and Jung had put Barbara Hanna and von Franz in their own space, in their own castle out of Bollingen in very isolated conditions. So von Franz at the very end of the film says, when we are alone, at that point, what's inside, what our psyche has some chance of emerging. And to me, that has some point related to what these terrifying things are.
Yeah, it is a frightening idea. Maybe Jung was depressed when he wrote that. Yeah. Do we know what it was that you frightened her so much? We don't know.
The only thing that I recall from what she was saying is that he described something 50 or 60 years after his death that would come about on the planet of destruction, sort of like what we see in climate change.
Yeah. Well,
A cheerful note.
yeah. Oh, listen, I have to go. I just want to mention that all this material is amplified in this book, if anybody's interested in it. It's called The God Image from Antiquity to Jung. And the chapter that I took this talk from is one of the chapters in this book. And if all else fails, you can use it as a doorstop. It's quite big.
Yeah.
Right, I really have to go. I'm afraid my voice is failing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Corbett.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Corbett. It was wonderful. And I'm sure for some people who want to continue to talk about this, we'll keep it open for another half an hour.
Okay.
And I'll be in touch with you, Dr. Corbett, about what we talked about earlier.
Okay.
So thank you so much. Feel better. Okay.
Thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Bye.